you first become involved with Gemstar Asia?
I first became involved with Gemstar when I met Gemma on a visit she was making to Singapore about 2 years ago. In fact, interestingly, it was at an event where the Minister for Trade, Andrew Robb, was speaking to the Chamber of Commerce. So it was very fitting that she was here at a time when our minister was talking about the links between Singapore and Australia and the commercial opportunities. Gemma told me her aspirations for bringing Australian innovation to Singapore as a launch pad, if you like, to the rest of the world. I could see her passion and her enthusiasm and her expertise, and I thought that would be a pretty exciting thing to be involved with. And from my point of view, it fitted very neatly with that my very small niche, which is Australian business coming to the region.
And I understand you've been working and involved with Asia for many years. Can you tell me just a little bit about your background and some of the changes that you've perhaps seen in particularly Singapore over that time?
Sure. Yes, I left Australia in 1980, to be precise, April Fool's Day in 1980. And I was working for Citibank, so banking was my background. Citi took me to head office in New York for a couple of years, and then I got posted to Manila, which was really my introduction to Asia. So I was there for 3 years, then Jakarta for 3.5, and then Thailand, and I was there for 3.5 years. And then almost 25 years ago, I came to Singapore. I think the biggest change is when I first arrived in Asia, almost 35 years ago, no one was talking about the Asian century then. Most of the countries in the region had their problems. China was still in turmoil and certainly wasn't contributing to world growth at that stage. It was an interesting posting. It was something that I really enjoyed, but I wasn't there because I thought this is going to be the focus of world growth. But that's the biggest change, because today nobody questions, I don't think, that this is the Asian century and a great opportunity for Australia, therefore, because it's in the neighbourhood. And we've seen hundreds of millions of people in this region pulled out of poverty during that time and starting to enter the consuming class and buying branded goods, and that's a huge opportunity for the world economy, but especially, again, Australia.
What do you think the future looks like for Asia?
I'm pretty bullish. I mean, you'll read in the newspapers today that expectations for growth this year for Singapore are a bit ho-hum. They're not going into recession, but it's nothing like what we saw over the last 30 or 40 or 50 years. There will always be short-term ups and downs, and that's not really a problem. We're talking about what's going to happen for the next few decades. And I think we're absolutely in the sweet spot for the world economy. I think this Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the 10 countries of ASEAN, are really perfectly positioned to benefit from the fact that they've got China as a neighbor on one side, India, which is also the emerging giant, on the other side. The economies and the countries generally are stable, broadly speaking. I mean, there are some issues, of course. You can talk about the politics of Thailand and so forth, but broadly speaking, the business sector, the commercial sector in those countries is doing just fine and will continue to do so. And I think because of the demographics, we've got young people in this region, whereas China is getting older. So China, for example, is pushing their manufacturing base into countries like Thailand and Myanmar and Vietnam and so forth, building supply chains throughout those regions. So is India, so is Japan, and so is the United States, and so should Australia be. But that's all contributing to long-term success. And I just think that it's impossible to identify a part of the world that is better positioned for growth in the next 20 to 30 years. And with those 625 million people who live in ASEAN, huge chunks of them are entering the consuming class every year. Roughly the population of Australia each year moves into that position where they want to buy goods, branded goods. And that again is just a huge opportunity for Australia.
What do you think Australia can learn from Singapore, and then vice versa, what do you think Singapore could perhaps learn from Australia?
I think Australia can learn a lot from Singapore about Asia, about doing business in Asia. This is the perfect place to come to establish a base, to get your feet wet for Asia, and then look beyond Singapore to the other opportunities further afield. So it's a great stepping stone to the region. But looking the other way, Singapore is smart enough to realize it can learn from everybody, and it does. Singapore has reinvented itself about, even in my time, at least 2 or 3 times, and in the time it's existed as a country, probably 5 times, as it went from being really just a logistics hub in the colonial days to then being a low-cost manufacturer. And then as labor costs increased, it moved up the technology scale, and then it moved into services, and particularly financial services, but telecommunications and so forth. And now, of course, it's becoming a technology hub. As it reinvents itself each time, it looks around for the best examples to follow. But narrowing that question down a little bit, or giving a couple of specific examples perhaps, there's some debate at the moment about gender diversity, for example, on boards of directors. Singapore hasn't done so well at that. But there is intent and there is willingness. And they look at Australia, because Australia has moved from, I think in the last 6 years, from about 8% of directors were female 6 years ago. Today that's about 23%, and it's smartly moving up. In the same time as Singapore, we've moved maybe from 6% to about 8.5% or 9%. So not so good. But they ask, what is Australia doing? How have they achieved that, and how can we learn from that? Of course, they look at other countries as well. They look at Norway, where it's the law. You must have 40% of your directors female. Singapore would never do that, and I don't think Australia would ever do that. But they look at everything. The other great thing about Singapore and the Singapore-Australia relationship is Singaporeans really know what's going on in Australia much better than Australians know what's going on in Singapore. If you look at today's newspaper, there are two articles here about the Turnbull government and about trade relations with Indonesia. I just don't think we'd see that kind of thing in the Australian media about Singapore. But Singaporeans have been educated in Australia. We've got, 200,000 Singaporeans who got their university degree from an Australian institution. They all go to Australia for their vacation. A lot of them have homes in Australia. The links are much stronger than I think the average Australian would realise. And because of that familiarity, there is that opportunity to learn from Australia. I would say, just closing up on this point, the other thing that Singapore, I think, could learn from Australia, and I think would like to learn from Australia, is a more relaxed or a more open society, if you like. When we talk about innovation, if you're going to be successful as an innovation hub, then I think you have to allow for failure, and you have to have openness of conversation and discussion and media and so forth. I think Australia does that better than Singapore at the moment. And I think Singapore understands that.